and welcome to another episode of Boring History. My name is Angela, and for today's episode we're going to be exploring the life and works of Plutarch. Now, of course, I'd love for you to stick around, but I also don't want you to waste your time, so just for clarity, today's video is just going to be a brief overview about some of the key things that Plutarch was known for, and a little bit about how he approached his writing. It is by no means an in-depth analysis on the guy, however, if you are interested in that type of thing, I have put a couple of my references down below, and both of those books do offer you a super insight into the life and works of Plutarch. And with that out of the way, if you're still with me, let's get started. Plutarch, whose full name was L. Mestrius Plutarchus, was born around AD 46, and he reached the ripe old age of 73 or 74. Plutarch was born in a town near Thebes, and he spent the majority of his life there. And during the lifetime of Plutarch, the Roman occupation of Greece had well and truly occurred. But as we all know, the Romans were a bit of a fan of Greek culture and myths and statues and stuff, so a lot of the Greek stuff was still floating around. Plutarch liked travelling, and he visited Asia, Egypt, parts of Italy, and he had some friends in pretty high places back in Rome. His family was one of the Greek families who had learned to easily and quickly adapt to life under the Roman Empire, which also meant that his family were quite well to do. Plutarch had a wife whose name was Timoxena, and the exact number of children that he had was uncertain. Although from his Constellatio, we roughly know that he had a daughter who died as an infant and at least 4 sons. Plutarch was a philosopher, a writer, and he's known to have written at least 200, if not more, works over the course of his life. He was also a priest at Delphi during the last 30 years of his life. So for all intents and purposes, Plutarch had a pretty comfortable life. However, he also had a bit of #wanderlust, I guess you would say. Is that still a thing? Anyway, the biggest problem that it appeared Plutarch had with his life is that not a lot of exciting things were happening in the world. In one of his essays, or dialogues, called Oracles, he points out that back in its heyday, the Delphic oracle was a symbol of greatness, and it was consulted on affairs of the highest order concerning state or military conquests. But during his time as a priest, Plutarch noticed that there was a different type of clientele, should we say, consulting the Delphic oracle for advice. With questions being more to the tune of, should I get married? Should I go on that trip? What's the weather going to be like next week? Now, Plutarch wasn't necessarily implying that this was a bad thing, he was simply making an observation that things were a little bit different and a little less exciting. And this is because he really admired the great leaders and statesmen of the past who had lived during a time where there was a lot of excitement. He appreciated the importance and the difficulty of some of the decisions and actions that these leaders would have had to make, and the impact that they would have had on the events of the time. Hence his Parallel Lives was created, where he compared well-known Greek humans to well-known Roman humans. And he did this 23 times. 23 comparisons were made, and I think he also did a few standalone analyses. If you haven't read a lot of ancient texts, or at least translations of ancient texts, I actually highly recommend Plutarch's Lives because they read really easily. Or at least the translations read really easily. And importantly, they're also interesting. Plutarch was fascinated with the actions of great leaders and the thought process that led to those actions, and not so much in the actual events of history themselves. Which is an important distinction to make because Plutarch's primary objective was to glorify his subject and to entertain his reader, and not so much about recording history. One of my friends actually compared him to the tabloid of the ancient world, which I thought was quite clever. And he definitely wasn't trying to be the next Thucydides or Herodotus. A good example of the approach that he took is actually found in his writings on Solon, who was like an Athenian statesman born around 640 BC and was kind of thought to have laid the foundation for the Athenian democratic system, or something like that. But anyway, there's this part in the biography of Solon where Plutarch mentions that one of the meetings Solon is said to have had with this other dude has actually been disproven by scholars on the basis of chronological reasons. Which just means that Solon and this dude couldn't have been in the meeting at the same time because there's proof that one of them was somewhere else. Plutarch's take on this discrepancy is that you shouldn't necessarily allow the rules of chronology to discredit something, especially when the events are super well known and if the events fit with the character of the person in question. So if they're doing something that they're likely to have done, then you probably should just believe that they did it, regardless of whether or not it fits in the timeline. Don't let a little something like proof get in the way of a good story. But having said that, historians have suggested that Plutarch wasn't necessarily completely wrong with this approach that he took, because the chronologies of Persian, Greek, all those histories that were available to him at the time weren't necessarily 100% accurate, so there was definitely some room for error. So I guess the main concern that some more modern historians have with his work is that he wasn't hugely interested in finding out the truth, so long as it fit in with his story. He was more interested in creating an exciting narrative. Which kind of leads to another issue that's been raised with Plutarch's work, his range of source material. Now there is enough evidence that still survives that proves that Plutarch did actually consult a very wide range of source material when researching for his work. And if we remember that Plutarch lived during the early ADs and somebody like, say, Solon lived in the 600 to 500 BCs, quite a significant amount of time had passed between Plutarch and his subject. So the fact that he was able to gather an array of different source materials is actually quite impressive. However, because there's always a however, it's also quite obvious that a lot of the facts that Plutarch used in his life were based on the information or the works of this Roman historian named Pollio, who existed like a full generation or two before Plutarch. Which means that even though Plutarch had all these other sources available to him and knew of these other sources, these sources were only really used to provide fun facts or to fill in the gaps if parts of Pollio's work weren't detailed enough. Now, I guess it should be pointed out that this way of using, or I guess not using source material, wasn't a uniquely Plutarch way of doing things. There's heaps of evidence that a lot of ancient writers also took this same approach, where they essentially let the reader know that they've done all of this reading, but then proceed to only reference from one source. Another reason there may be some inaccuracies in the works of Plutarch, especially when he's claiming to be quoting from another source, is that a lot of ancient writers, like Plutarch, relied a lot on memory when it came to doing their work. Because of course it wouldn't have been like today where you can vaguely remember something that you read ages ago, do a quick Google search and find the original source. There was no easy way to quickly jog or refresh your memory. Plutarch would have vaguely remembered something that he read a couple of years ago and he would have simply done his best to rewrite it. One example of this can be found in the quotations he gives in Brutus's letters, where historians can now see that he's actually jumbled together two different passages from two different letters. Anyway, I didn't mean for this video to become an analysis on his parallel lives and his style of writings or a critique on his style of writing, so instead let's move on to another one of his works known as the Moralia. Moralia loosely translates to morals or matters relating to customs and more. Essentially, it's a collection of essays and speeches on ethical, religious, philosophical, political, all those fun types of topics. Now, there's generally two ways that his essays are presented. So there's the speeches, which are like transcripts of things that were said at important functions, and then there's the more informal transcripts of speeches or conversations that would have been held between Plutarch's friends and family. Plutarch wrote more than 60 of these essays, and there were some fairly interesting topics discussed. For example, one essay discusses whether land or sea animals are more intelligent, another one debates whether fire or water is more useful. And if you're looking for a topic for your own ancient history essay, perhaps you would like to borrow one of his ideas on whether the Athenians were more well known for their wisdom or their war. A rather famous human who took inspiration from Plutarch on how to dramatize history was none other than the great William Shakespeare. And there are full academic analyses that have been done on the inspiration that Shakespeare took from Plutarch's parallel lives. In particular, Plutarch's life of Caesar and Brutus, which Shakespeare then took as inspiration or source material for his own tragedy on the life of Julius Caesar. If you're interested in this type of thing and the Plutarch-Shakespeare comparison, I've listed a source book or a reference book for you down below. And with that, I'm going to end today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope it wasn't too basic for you. Hopefully you've learned something, or if you have some facts that I didn't mention about Plutarch, please feel free to share them down below. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you'll consider subscribing because I look forward to sharing even more boring history with you in the future.